Well, it's a privilege to be able to share from God's Word this morning. We're going to be looking at a passage from Genesis chapter 45, if you want to turn there. And we're going to get into that in just a moment. But as we begin, I want you to think about all you know about bridges. You're going to be using your imagination a lot this morning, and you're going to paint pictures all over the screen behind you as if there were a PowerPoint. But they're going to be your own, so if you don't like them, sorry, can't do anything about that. But think of all the different types of bridges you've seen in your life. Around here, you think of a bridge, you think of something that hopefully is going to be unchanging. It's going to get you from point A to point B in your vehicle and not going to collapse in the process. But there are a lot more types of bridges than that one that I just described. When I first became acquainted with Wendy, my wife, it was in Chicago, but we made a journey shortly thereafter down to Louisiana. And Louisiana is filled with waterways, filled with bayous, moving water around in and behind homes. You can have a whole housing development on what essentially ends up being an island, and you have to get back and forth to home over a bridge. And so when the bridge goes out, you're stranded. But there's different kinds of bridges. She was reminding me last night of the different types of bridges there are. There are those bridges which fold up in the middle like this to let the tall boats across. They do a lot of trawling and shrimping down there. And so what that means is they have these tall structures on the boats like this. And I'm trying to help you get the image in your head. It's really up there. But, and then these tall poles come down like this, and they have nets on them, and then they drag the nets along, and they go in a circular motion with the boat and pull in all kinds of fish that way. And then they bring the nets over into the boat and sort through the fish, throw back what they don't want, and keep the rest, and do it again. So when they're going home for the night, those poles are up in the air like this and much taller than the bridges around home. And so they have to make a way through the bridge. So they move the bridge. It may fold up like this, or there may be bridges that actually hinge out this way and let the boats through and hinge back into place. There are the bridges that are just so tall that they don't need to do any of that, right? And so they just span the larger bodies of water like the Mississippi. And hopefully the bridges, the boats that go under there are smart enough to know their height and not run into the bridge at the top. But it happens. And then everybody's put out because it could have been avoided, and the captain got either too close to the moorings of the bridge and damaged them, causing the bridge to shut down and people would have to go miles out of the way to get home. Or it could be they misjudged the height. There's a bridge called the Sunshine Bridge, which I was able to cross twice last week because we went down south for a memorial for the folks that live in Louisiana that weren't able to come to my father-in-law's funeral here, memorial service. We did one for them down south. And so I was over the Sunshine Bridge twice, and that's one of those big ones that spans the Mississippi. And it had damage from a barge that went underneath with a crane on top, and the crane was too tall. And so it damaged the bridge, caused millions of dollars of damage, and shut it down. And people get frustrated with those sorts of situations, understandably so. So the idea that I'm getting at is that there are the bridges. Oh, before I get to my idea, there's one other type of bridge that I think is pretty fun. You'll want to hear about this. There's floating bridges. So the bridges go up and down with the level of water because, as you know, we send an awful lot of water down there in certain seasons, and the waterways swell. And so these bridges are designed to float upward in the middle, and then on the edges they have some kind of a ramp like this that moves as the middle comes up. And so that allows cars to get over even when the bridge is higher. And the funny story is someone who shall remain unnamed in the family was at one point driving a Cadillac, so that gives you a little bit of a hint, and forgot that road conditions aren't always the same on the floating bridges. And so the bridge was higher than usual, the speed was the same, and it went over that bridge, Dukes of Hazzard style. That ramp, that lift off, as you can imagine. Oh my. Bridges are wonderful when they're functional. Bridges in relationships are wonderful when they're functional, but there are those times when there are broken bridges where things aren't what you expect. And so we're going to be dealing with how to overcome that in life this morning. And I'm going to dive into this portion of Scripture, and I'm going to do something I really shouldn't do to you. I'm going to give you the climax of this whole story that spans chapters in the Scriptures right from the get-go. So it would be like, has anyone watched the latest Spider-Man movie over here? I'm trying to keep Jamaica folks awake, hopefully. That's tough. They were up to 2 last night or more. So it would be like giving you an image from later in the movie of Mysterio, right before you start watching the whole thing. That's what I'm doing to you this morning. So those of you who didn't understand that didn't need to, it's okay. But I'm giving away the climax of the story as we read this passage. So let's look at it. Genesis chapter 45, verse 1. Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer them, for they were dismayed at his presence. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near, and he said, "I am your brother, Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land for these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on the earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and a lord to all of his house, a ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry up and go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, don't tarry. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, your flocks and your herds and all that you have. There I will provide for you, for there are yet 5 years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have do not come to poverty. And now your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see, and that it is my mouth that speaks to you. And you must tell my father of all my honor in Egypt, and of all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here." And then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept. And Benjamin wept upon his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that, his brothers talked with him. You can tell it's a story that's filled with emotion. And that emotion has been building for literally years prior. And so we're going to refer briefly back to snippets from that story. And I need a little bit of response. Rick, you were one of the drivers. I said I would call on you. So when I mention part of the past story, I need you to say, right? Right? Like you fully recall what we talked about last week. Right? So with Rick, I need another 10 or so. Can we just practice that for a moment? So I'll point at the screen and you'll see an image from a past episode in this story, such as Joseph and his many-colored tunic that was given to him, right?
Right.
Okay, so that's what we're going for. So just recall these snippets and paint them all over that screen so that we can track and get the emotion and the thrust of what is being communicated. God is more powerful than all of our broken bridges. God is more powerful than all of our broken bridges. He can work out things that feel beyond repair. God's power can heal despite broken bridges in our past. And so as we think about the story of Joseph, think about all the broken bridges. My goodness. And in narrative literature, in the Old Testament, you see these stories and they just unfold almost without commentary. And you see the brokenness and all of these things that happen to the biblical characters and these men and women and the choices that they made in life. And Joseph's life is full of broken bridges, either his own or that of his family. So brokenness resulted in Jacob's life due to favoritism. Do you remember the coat
Right.
that he gave to his son? And how that caused such unrest in his life? Because he was the only son of all of his sons that he could have given something to make it even. He only gave him one, to the one son, to the favored son. And so that caused all kinds of brokenness in the relationships between Joseph and his brothers. And so they grew angry to the point where they wouldn't even talk to him, or when they saw him coming, they grumbled and scowled. And the greatest brokenness of all was when they threw him in a pit. He was sent out to find out if they were okay. And they threw him in a pit and then decided to sell them to the traveling Midianites. And these were also named Ishmaelites. And so Judah came up with this plan. Let's take him out of the pit. Let's sell him to those traders on that road. And this is part of the brokenness that formed the past of Joseph. He experienced the rejection and the betrayal of his closest family members and was sold into a foreign land, never to be seen in that region. Not never. There's more to the story. But he was sold and sent far away for the next 22 years. Brokenness was present also in the brothers that did that damage, though. Think about it. If you had gotten angry, gotten jealous of your sibling, and did something rash, and did something really stupid, and had to live with that for the rest of your life, think of how that would plague you. Maybe you have a situation like that in your own life. And so their conscience was constantly nagging them because of what had happened. And just prior to this story, they had gone to Egypt, made a caravan with all the brothers but one, Benjamin, and had gone for supplies. You see that caravan as it travels on, right? And that caravan arrives in Egypt, and Joseph recognizes the brothers and begins his testing of them. And when they had to go back and they found the money in their sacks, and they're talking to one another, what arises out of them but the sense that God is punishing them for the harm that they had done. It was very present still in their mind, what they had done to their brother. And so there was brokenness within the brothers themselves in this story. So Judah had conspired to sell Joseph, and yet the salvation that God's power accomplished through this was amazing. Amazing. So much so that the brothers couldn't quite believe it. As we read through that passage this morning, did you count how many times Joseph said, "It's me"? And don't worry. There were 3 different times he had to say, "I am Joseph." See, Joseph had dealt with all of this over time. From the time he recognized his brothers and started supplying them with needs, devised the test to see if they had changed. All of this time, Joseph is mulling over his past and his broken bridges in his life. And he had time to process it. But then as he finally comes to this, remember, this is the main scene in the story, and he says, "I am Joseph." That 3 words, right? The brothers hadn't processed this at all. They didn't know if he was alive or dead or anything else. But with those 3 words, he just blurts it out. "I am Joseph." And what's the next thing that comes off his tongue? where is my father? Is he really still alive? He needed to hear it from them. And at that point, they were dumbfounded. They couldn't say anything. They were horrified, is the idea in the text. And so they couldn't speak. They were trembling. They couldn't even think straight at that point. And he's asking for a response. And so Joseph has to take a couple steps back, ratchet it down a little bit, right? And he comes at it more carefully and more cognizant of where they're at. And he says, I am your brother, Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And he step by step, he says in verse 5, and don't be dismayed or angry. He's taking into account what our natural defenses are when we're confronted with the truth of our past in a dangerous situation. And he says, don't be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. What a mature response he's able to give. But it didn't come to him like that. He'd been processing this. He'd gone through slavery. He'd gone through being thrown in prison, false accusations, all kinds of brokenness tacked onto the initial being sold into slavery. And yet he comes to this conclusion as he sees his brothers coming, needing his help, remembers his dreams, perhaps a little guilty about the way he told the brothers and his parents about the dreams and how he was like a snotty-nosed kid and just kind of bragging. Perhaps, I'm reading into the text here, but he had some of that to sort through and then to realize, but God is more powerful than these broken bridges. And God had a plan. And that's what he's able to share. But then a third time he has to say, now your eyes see, verse 12, the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my mouth that speaks to you. The idea here most likely is that, okay, up until that point he was speaking through an interpreter. Pero en ese momento él estaba hablando en el idioma de ellos. Y ellos podían comprender todo lo que él decía en su lengua madre. So, since I'm in church, I better translate. At that moment, he switched into his mother tongue, and they could understand everything directly. And so it was yet another layer of that revealing of himself to convince them who he was, and then to settle their fears, and ask again what he really wanted to know. How's Dad? How is my father? I want to be close to him again. And so there's this drawing in and this mending of the bridge that is taking place over time. It took time to get broken. And he's working on bringing the parties, the guilty parties, all back together. And really, it's God's hand that's accomplishing it. So Jacob's whole family has experienced and been deeply impacted by the brokenness for years. As I was talking about how he had to say it 3 different times, I'm reminded of how I proposed to Wendy. I was very, very slow and specific, and I used very few words. Will you marry me? Just 4 words. Because I learned a lesson. When we started dating, in my mind, I asked her if she wanted to date me and initiated that relationship over a conversation that took place over a meal. And afterwards, it seemed like we were on the same page, and so I held her hand going back to, back to Moody Bible Institute where we were studying at the time, and she was surprised that I was holding her hand, and she went with it, but she was, well, that's kind of forward. I didn't know. So at breakfast the next day, I found out from one of her friends that she was just curious what this was all about. She heard that we were dating from someone else. And so, direct, slow, clear, made sure, had the ring, we got that across. So Jacob, yeah. Okay. Oh my. So God is more powerful than our broken bridges. Secondly, God is more powerful because he can bring healing despite our own terrible experiences. Sometimes it's not sin that we ourselves have walked into or stumbled into, but we've had to suffer greatly. Think again of Joseph in Potiphar's household, right? And he is taken care of. God's furthered him. He's brought him up and placed him over Potiphar's entire household, and he's doing a diligent job. And suddenly his wife starts nagging him and nagging him and nagging him. And finally, after refusing him the very last time, he runs out of there. His robe is left behind, and she accuses him falsely of being impertinent and making advances on her. And so he runs out of there, but gets thrown into prison by Potiphar. Yet again, a really bad circumstance that comes his way. And he could easily have thrown up his arms at God and said, "What are you doing?" And you know what? That's the thing about the narrative story. We only get portions of the story. We don't know what his response was along the way. He could have responded just that way, "God, what are you doing?" Right? And so you might see on that screen something like that. Right? And moments in your own life when you've turned to God and said, "God, I don't understand. What is going on here?" But it would seem, as we read, that he came to the point of recognizing this very truth, that God is more powerful than these broken experiences in our life. So God's plan was such that even in spite of Joseph's broken experience with Potiphar, he got thrown into prison, but it was the prison where the people that Pharaoh was angry with got thrown, and those experiences with the cupbearer and so forth brought him into the very presence of Pharaoh. So God used that brokenness that he didn't call upon himself to bring him to such a position to be exalted once again, only this time to second in command. And he mentions a couple of different times, tell my father of my success. Tell him of what God's done. Tell him that God has been with me. I can identify, maybe each of you can identify with the desire for your dad to know that you did well, that you made it, that all that he put into you, right? That it's worth it. And that God took it and did something with it. So Joseph's feeling that. And that's why he wanted so badly for those brothers to hurry and get back there and bring Jacob and get back together a family that had been torn apart into pieces so long ago, 22 years ago, and to restore that which was broken. And the Holy Spirit was at work in him, and he could see it now. He could see what had been hidden, right? The hidden blessings that we can't see, that we don't know if there will ever be a time when God will use this yucky stuff in our life and redeem it and bring about change. So, simple illustration of this. It's one of those, I have no idea if God will use it, but this week, the family had driven down before, but I had a chance to just fly down to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where all of that weather is right now. Fly down and back in a 24-hour period. And so I got down there, got there in time, had a great crawfish dinner. Wonderful. I really appreciate that. I miss that more often. And then we had the memorial service. Had the opportunity to share with family who don't know Jesus. And so it was a great opportunity. But coming back, we had finished up there in the fellowship hall of the church that was kind enough to host us. And it took a little while talking with all the family and finishing up those conversations. And so when I got to the airport, I had just barely enough time to get my ticket and get up to the gate and leave. But it was a small airport. So guess what? The ticketing agent on the first floor where you enter and the gate agent were one and the same. So needless to say, there was no one at the whole desk to print me a ticket. And got up to security, and the lady there was kind enough to take my driver's license to the lady at the gate and say, you know, he's here, can we do something about this? No. So I had turned in my rental car. I was in the airport. It was 7 o'clock at night, a little before. Flight was 7:04. So there I was, and I told Wendy, you know, pray, and she brought the license back and said, no, I can't do it. And so I said, well, you know, she said, I'm praying for favor. I said, well, favor doesn't just left. I just gone. It's just not going to happen here. And then I thought about the theme of the sermon, of hidden blessings. And I thought, okay, all right, God, I shouldn't have chosen that, but anyway. And so I got back down to the desk and waited about half an hour or 45 minutes. The flight left, and they closed down the gate. And the lady come back down to the ticketing desk, and I asked, you know, can we get a different flight? And she looked at my ticket and said, you're flying basic economy. I can't touch this. You're going to have to call this number. So I walked away with this card and made some phone calls. And God was gracious. I was able to get the 6 a.m. flight. But I spent the night in the hotel. Anybody ever done that before? Maybe it's just a missionary kid thing, I don't know, but I wasn't about to spend, you know, $100 for a hotel, and had my laptop, had my sermon to prepare, and so I spent the night on the couches that I put together in the corner with my carry-on and my laptop, and I thought, I Googled the next day, was there a plane crash that got me? You know? I don't know why I missed that flight, but there it is. It's stuff that happens. So by faith, though, I want you to believe and to allow this morning to get to the point where you allow the idea that God can be more powerful than your broken bridges. Think of each of the brothers. Think of your brothers, half-brothers, half-sisters, anyone in your family. Think of some of those relationships and the hurt that might have built up over the years. Maybe even comparable to some of these things that we've read about or thought about and rehearsed in our minds. Right? God is there. God can do it. And so I want us to reignite the colors that should permeate our mind and our eyesight as we see the world around us. It's not a black and white kind of a world. It's full of colors. I think back to Joseph and his colored tunic that he was given. I don't know why I always picture it with stripes. Is that what your picture looks like? Is it stripes? I wonder if it's patchwork though. I mean, you know, lots of bright colors. Who knows? But when we look out at life and we look at some of these circumstances, we can get so jaded, so scientific, so resigned to brokenness and fallenness that we rule out God's ability and the fact that He is more powerful and can do, if He chooses, He can repair any of our broken bridges. Amen. He is that big. And so faith, as I'm defining it today, is a sanctified imagination of what God can do. It's a can-do attitude with God factored in. So lastly, God's power can even bless future generations in spite of sinful situations, in spite of brokenness. God's power can even bless future generations in spite of our personal failures or our personal brokenness that we've experienced. In this story, we see a plan that was much, much bigger than Jacob's favoritism mishap, right? I don't know if Jacob ever looked at that and thought, maybe I shouldn't have given him that. Just him, maybe I don't know. He seemed to still be showing favoritism because he didn't send Benjamin, did he? Right. So that was still broken. But the brothers could still have held it against him. But what do we see? We see Judah stepping up and saying no to Joseph when he was told that Benjamin had to stay back and that they could go home, but Benjamin would become a slave in Pharaoh's court. That was one of those scenes, you remember it?
Yeah. Right.
But Judah said, no, my father will die if I get back there and do not have Benjamin. I promised, I based my life on this. I want to stay in Benjamin's place. And so that transformation had occurred to where Judah loved his father just as much as Joseph did, and Judah loved his brother enough to take his place and become a slave so that Benjamin could go back home. There was transformation. And then God's plan was even broader than Jacob's favoritism. It was broader as well than Judah and his brother's sin. God changed Judah's heart over time, and God brought about a deep reconciliation between the offended parties. You look at it as it went down. First Joseph says, I'm Joseph. How's my dad? And then he says, now, I'm Joseph that you sold. Yes, you did that. And I know it, but I still want you to know that I'm not going to hold it against you because God was really the one who used that. God was at work. And then you get all the way to the end, and he says, it's me. You know, I'm speaking to you in your own language. I won't do that to you again. And then he had said, come close, but now he goes to Benjamin, and he embraces him physically and brings him in tight. And he does that with each of the brothers, too, not just Benjamin, the favored one, but each of the brothers. And he physically puts his hands around them, kisses them, hugs them, loves them. It would make anyone else in the area a little bit uncomfortable, all this show of emotion. That's why the Egyptians had been sent out, right? They heard about it because it was loud. I don't know if you've ever, well, many of you have. You've been to Israel. You know the boisterousness of the culture and how as they interact. It's not in quiet ways, is it? It's up front, in your face. It almost feels like a yelling match between people when they're discussing things. And that's the way that